This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. What happens when two American journalists move to China and put their toddler son into a traditional military-style education system in Shanghai? That's the premise of the book Little Soldiers, An American Boy at Chinese School in a Global Race to Achieve. It's also my pick for the EWA Radio Summer Reading List. Joining us today is the author, Lenora Chu. Welcome to EWA Radio.
Hi, Emily. Thanks for having me.
We're delighted to have you. Let's start off by explaining that you and your husband, Rob Schmitz, who is an NPR Shanghai correspondent, moved to China with your young son, and it turned out that one of the best schools in the country was actually just a few blocks away from where you decided to live.
Sure. When you move to a new neighborhood, you pick up very quickly the schools that people are talking about. And this particular school is a kindergarten. It was just a few blocks down the street. You hear that the teachers have graduate degrees, that they're well paid, that it's a laboratory for Chinese education reform. It's beautiful. It's got a sparkling green lawn. This was the school we wanted to get into.
And getting into it wasn't as simple as just walking up to the door and saying, hey, let us in. I mean, you had to pull some strings and play some cards that you fortunately had with you. One of them was, of course, the cachet of being foreigners.
And not only that, Mandarin-speaking foreigners. I am of Chinese heritage, and my husband, he had gone to the country as a Peace Corps volunteer back in the 1990s. And so he had a familiarity with the language and the culture. And we swung by a few times, wrote some letters, and it was a whole process, but we finally managed to get a spot.
Before you put your son in the school, you had a conversation with your husband and expressed some concerns about what this kind of system might do to him or for him, weighing the pros and cons. And one of the concerns was the conformity that's demanded of very young children in these schools. And you worried it might actually change how his personality developed. You did see some changes right away, didn't you? What did you notice?
Right away. He was 3 when he went to school for the first time, and it happened to be this school. And he just didn't like it. He was forced to eat an egg very early on. And he told me that he eventually swallowed because the teacher required him to do so. These are not things that I'm accustomed to. I went to public schools in the US, and to have a teacher force your son to do something and he's uncomfortable with, I was not okay with that. But I very quickly learned that the teachers at this school, and I would say Chinese culture in general, do not invite questioning. They think teacher knows best. And this is the big adjustment I had to make.
In a very early parent-teacher conference, you actually were scolded for not presenting a united front with the teachers in front of your son. And it's interesting because you could see why that would be a very necessary step for the system to work.
Basically, the teacher said to me, don't ever question my authority in front of a child again. I had confronted her about this egg eating incident and a number of other things. And she said, okay, don't do it in front of your kid, because when you show disrespect to me, the kid will follow, and then I cannot manage the classroom. Now, this was a shock. I think I was so dumbfounded. I really didn't know what to say. I think I ran away. I sort of ran off, and I went to my husband and I said, what do we do now? I can't express any objections to the way she's running her classroom. This was a novel concept to me.
One of the challenges for you and your husband was to let go of some of these American expectations about individuality and really buy into the system. How did that unfold?
It took some time. So I should give you some background. When we first put our son in the school, Shanghai was taking the international education headlines because of a test called Pisa. Now, you're very familiar with this test. The OECD goes around and tests teenagers in nearly 70 countries, and Shanghai came in number 1 in math, reading, and science. So you have this dialogue about Shanghai being one of the best education systems in the world. Then you have little me on the ground having a very different experience with my son in what was supposedly one of the best early education experiences you could have in Shanghai. And this was just cognitive dissonance. I began to think, is the secret to academic achievers just developing kids who do what they're told, who don't question authority? And this became sort of the driving question in my narrative, is to figure out where the balance lay on this discipline question.
While you did see some concerning developments for your son, there were also a lot of positive benefits, both academic and social emotional. Let's talk a little bit about that.
So the teacher was a bit of a scary authority figure to him in the early days, but then he eventually began to learn little behaviors like saluting the teacher not saluting, but it was more like, good morning, teacher. How are you? Excited to start the day. It was all this signaling around the idea that education is important and that the teacher is to be respected. And I grew to realize that the teacher really wanted to set the stage. If you think about it, early education is the foundation for teaching kids what you value. And on this particular aspect, I thought that it was a good lesson for him to learn. I didn't agree with the methods, and that's what's so hard about the Chinese way, is that I don't like how they got there. But in many ways, the end result is positive.
What's interesting, though, that you bring out in your book is that there are some Chinese educators who are also not that comfortable with some aspects of the quote-unquote Chinese way. And you talk about how they're circling around to certain Western concepts, particularly in considering students' social, emotional well-being. What are they pulling from the West? And more specifically, what are they pulling from the U.S.?
The funny thing about Pisa is when the rest of the world was celebrating Shanghai's results, if you ask the Chinese about their PISA results, they think the Chinese system has a lot to improve. And that's all in the areas of critical thinking, independent expression, curiosity, all of these things that, frankly, Americans have been really, really good at. It's just part of the culture. I'll never forget, there's a Chinese teacher who just come back from visiting schools in New York City, preschools, and she said, American kids are allowed to sit in a circle on a mat at eye level with the preschool teacher. And that to them was just mind-boggling, that a student could be on the same level as a teacher. And she also said that the kids could get up in and out of the circle whenever they wanted. Now that, as a matter of culture, we're developing a kid's curiosity. They can sort of get out of the circle and explore something in the corner. They don't have to ask permission to go get a drink of water. These are things that from the very start is developing a kid's independence. And the Chinese are not very good at that.
What I did think was really interesting that you bring out in the book is early on this sort of sense of entitlement that you had at odds with the core of the Chinese system, which is this conformity. But also, conformity doesn't mean that they don't support status, that they're not looking to strive and have people singled out as high achievers. Explain a little bit how that balances out.
So very early on, I was shocked to see every so often, every few weeks or so, there would be a chart posted on the bulletin board next to the classroom door. And it would rank children on everything from height, weight, their ability on the recorder, whether they're following rhythm, whether they're showing up on time to class. All of this was posted very publicly for everyone to see. And it was sort of a shock to me until I understood that when the Chinese look at scores, it's not really an assessment of who's better and who's worse. It's an honest assessment of progress, right? How is your kid doing relative to the others? And in some sense, it's important, but they don't attach that sort of self-esteem, oh, let's worry about how Johnny feels about coming in 10th. They more see it as, well, Johnny's coming in number 10, so perhaps he needs to work harder. He needs to try harder. It's not intrinsically tied to worth. So in some sense, the Chinese find it easier to digest scores and rankings that way because they believe in this connection to effort. In America, it's funny. I actually found studies that show we are more likely to believe in innate talent. And in some sense, that makes us uncomfortable with scores and rankings, because we believe kids actually can't do any better if they're number 10, that they can't work harder to become number 1. And so that's a big cultural difference that I found that I had to come to grips with.
So is Chinese effort grit?
It is, especially when it comes to math. That was one of the biggest findings in my research. When I was looking at American math classrooms, there was a lot of praise of intelligence. Good job, smart kids. But in China, it was need to work harder, need to work harder. It was really that language and the signaling around math that I think we could learn from in the US, because we have a tendency to believe it's a talent, that it's not important, and that it's not something that every kid can learn. In China, they don't believe this. They look at every kid and think from the age of 3 that they can learn math with enough effort.
We're talking with Lenora Chu, journalist and book author, about her experience putting her young son into a Chinese public school. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Lenora, we talked a little bit about what the Chinese might be drawing from the West. One of the things the West looks to China for, I think, is the extraordinary teacher workforce. They're well paid relative to other professions, and they're revered in the culture. But I'm wondering, can we take that and make it work in the U.S. without changing so much about our teacher preparation programs, but also societal perceptions of what the role of the teacher is? Could we really import that?
It's something that is useful to think about. If you think about what draws people into a profession, they're thinking about things like salary and social status and work-life balance and that sort of thing. Now, teachers in the US, the salaries aren't quite there. The status has declined over the last few decades. And part of that is tied to not only the way society perceives the profession, but also what is government doing about it? Where is it headed? If you look at China, the policy documents talk about actually heightening teacher status. And the purpose is to keep people coming into the pipeline. When there are lots of people wanting to get into teacher colleges, that means you have the pick of some of the best scholars out there. They're actually doubling and tripling the funding that goes to teacher salaries over the next 5 or 10 years. Now, part of that is to hire new teachers, but part of that's also to boost the salaries of teachers already in the profession. When you see that kind of language, China is investing in education. You don't see that kind of language happening in the US. The other thing is something that we as parents can do. When you respect the teacher, when you show that the teacher is somebody not to be challenged on every little thing, you pick your battles. That's one big lesson I learned. So my teacher forced my son to eat an egg. He lived, and in fact, he loves eggs now. I just really started to think about it. Do I need to push back on everything? When I interviewed American teachers for this book, they were telling me, thank goodness I'm about to retire. That actually they're not feeling valued here. And I think part of it's society, part of it is the way government policy is headed, and part of it is just the way parents are pushing back. Can we import these ideas into the American system? Maybe not, but if we all start thinking about it in a different way, I think it's helpful. Andreas Schleicher, who runs Pisa, he says, Pisa it wasn't meant to be a ranking. He said it's to think about what works in other systems and whether some of those features can be reconfigured to your own context. And I think that's really helpful. Why aren't we talking about increasing teacher pay or respecting teachers more? And what does that look like?
There were some surprises for me here in this book. I was familiar, of course, with the college placement test that everyone is geared toward and working toward that will decide where you're going to end up at the college level. But what I was sort of stunned to find out was that there's the high school entrance test, and that 8 million children are essentially locked out of the secondary education system, and then opportunities for what we would consider a middle or upper class life. The door is closed.
Yes, that to me is more monumental, that you lose half of all students at that high school entrance exam. It's devastating. And I don't know why media don't cover that as much. I think it's more of a problem outside of the big cities, Shanghai and Beijing, where most foreign journalists are stationed. But this is a huge problem for China, and they know it. This is one of their number one priorities. It's inequality in the system. Can you imagine in the US if we looked at a test that our 16-year-old was facing, and if he or she passed, he goes on to high school, and if he or she doesn't, they're done. They go on to the vocational track. That is a lot of pressure, and that explains why people are so desperate to achieve from the start.
I would say, of course, it also reinforces, the critics of using that PISA score as rankings who say you can't laud China. You're looking simply at the Shanghai province where the students have already been squeezed out, and you're really getting the very best of the best, the cream of that crop.
That's a very controversial topic, and I sort of found it to be true. Shanghai is not representative of China, and anyone who knows the country realizes that. Now, if you've noticed, the last round of PISA results, they included 3 other provinces, and China did not do as well. That just goes to show the link between money and performance. Money is now a factor in how Chinese education performs.
I want to let our listeners know that the book has a lot of dimensions, and you do talk to some adult students, to some high schoolers who are getting ready for that college exam, and then also some families with children who don't make that cutoff and whose opportunities for future careers and learning are really truncated because of that. What's been the response to your book, particularly in your own neighborhood and that neighborhood school? Have you heard from them?
So the Chinese would never directly confront you on something, especially something as potentially controversial as this. I ran into the principal a couple of months ago, and she sort of squeezed me on the arm and gave me a smile. And that was the acknowledgement. That was almost all that needed to be said. I think there was a lot of nervousness leading up to the launch of the book, but they either accept it or they don't. And I think they have.
A few years ago, I talked with a student in San Francisco who had grown up in China and then moved to the U.S. for high school because his parents felt it would give him a better opportunity to attend an American college. And he really felt he had gotten the best of both worlds. He had the intensive academic foundation from his Chinese schooling, but now he had more freedom in his high school years to innovate and be creative. That seemed pretty similar to the conclusion you reached for your own family.
It is. It was painful for my son, but he's 9 now. He's got his multiplication tables down. He can recite them in, 30 seconds flat. He's doing drills. He's doing triple digit multiplication, addition, subtraction. These are things that he's not scared of, and he's gotten that from his Chinese education. One thing I continue to worry about is his respect for authority, his unwillingness to challenge openly someone that says something he doesn't agree with. If it's an authority figure or a teacher or a doctor, he's not necessarily willing to challenge in the moment. And we're here in the US right now for summer camp, and you see these American kids who are so willing to do that. And I think that's so wonderful. That's something that we as a culture do really well. So I think it's really hard to have it both ways. I talk to him constantly about this issue, and hopefully when we move back here, he won't have trouble adjusting. But that's one remaining issue that I continue to worry about.
Lenora Chu is an American journalist and the author of Little Soldiers, An American Boy, a Chinese School, and the Global Race to Achieve. Lenora, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you'd like to know more about or a summer book you'd like to recommend for the reading list, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.